G'day, James Galea here. Today we're going to look at trusting God when I'm married and isolated. Now, as I'm calling people, I'm realizing there's a similar theme that's coming around. Everyone's experience, whether married or single, is intensified. So those who are alone are feeling really alone. Those who are maybe married with kids and got kids all around them want to be alone. They can't escape. So everyone's experience is intensified during this COVID-19 lockdown. But there's also a tendency to think, if only I was like this, if only I was in this situation, then it would be easy, then it'd be okay to deal with this COVID-19, then things would be okay. But the reality is everyone is finding it hard in different ways. That's the first thing I want to say. As we look at being married and isolated, can I just say this is not just for those who are married, but also if you're single, listen in. Just as I encourage you, if you're married, have a listen to Being Single and Isolated podcast. Because we need at a time like this empathy. We need to listen, how are other people going through this? What are the challenges for them? And what are they going through? So I'll just say that just to preface what we're going to look at today. When it comes to trusting God, and when I'm married and isolated, I just want to highlight three things. The first is this: your spouse is not the enemy. Now, when you're stressed, when your weekly routine's out the door, when you're working, maybe with your spouse at home, when there's financial stress, whatever it might be, this bubbling feeling of anxiety and stress starts to well up. And generally it comes out onto your spouse. And we lash out and we say things that we regret, and we treat our spouse as if they were the ones that created COVID-19. They're not the enemy. We just acknowledge that, right? Because that is how we treat your bride, your wife, whatever it might be. That's how often we can treat them, as if they're the culprits. But often it's just ourselves struggling to deal with what we're going through. So that's the first thing. The spouse is not the enemy. The second thing I'd say is that there is purpose in this pandemic. Whenever something goes wrong, big or small, two things can happen. One is Satan uses hardship and difficulty to draw you away from God and draw you to sin. But the second thing is God, on the other hand, uses hardship and difficulty, whether big or small, and COVID-19 would be a big one, to draw you closer to Him and towards holiness. Have a look in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7, which says this: endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as His children. And verse 11 says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. What it's saying there is that God is a father, your father, and you are His child. And the word discipline there is not a punishment word, but a growing word. The word disciple comes from it. Where God is using this trial, this big one we're going through, to change and mold and shape you in ways that you may not think you need changing or shaping or molding in. When it comes to your marriage, God is the biggest advocate for your marriage. He is your biggest supporter of your marriage, not only surviving, but flourishing. And in His providence, He has used this hardship to take away the things that we normally go to at a sort of safety nets in our marriage. The weekend romantic escape. Can't do that anymore. The night out of the restaurant for a lovely dinner. Can't do that anymore. Babysit. Can't do that anymore. Taking them all away and getting us to ask the question, in this lockdown, you're going to still love your spouse? Husbands, in this lockdown, are you going to still serve and love your bride? Wives, in this lockdown, are you going to still build up and respect your husbands? Because all the things that we normally do have gone. And God is showing us something, that there is purpose in this, in our marriages, to expose things that we might not have realized were a problem, our habits, the way we go about life, we just go, and all of a sudden it's gone. And then you look at your spouse, think, I don't know how to communicate. I don't know how to talk because we're normally so big. Whatever it might be, God is teaching you something in this. He uses every hardship to do so. And what is it when it comes to your marriage that you need to grow in? The third and final thing is words are powerful. I don't know about you, but I've noticed in this season of particularly you sort of get self-protective. You sort of shut down and think, what do I'm not going to buy much, I'm not going to do much, I'm just going to, do the bare minimum. And often it comes with the words that I use. And so I'm sort of reluctant to say positive, encouraging words. But 1 Thessalonians 5 says, build one another up. And that's everyone, but particularly if you're married, your spouse. The other day, my wife stopped me and just said a couple of sentences where she'd noticed the way I was behaving that encouraged her when it came to this COVID-19 crisis we're in. And those words are a breath of fresh air to me. I needed them and they keep me going. And your spouse needs to be built up. So you're going to say, what's something that you can stop and thank them in? Something that you love about them, that you've noticed the way they handle certain situations in this crazy time we're in. Don't just self-protect, but rather build up and encourage them. At the end of this COVID-19, everyone's expecting to have done a whole bunch of projects. The DIY projects, get a six-pack, the garden's looking immaculate, all these projects that people have. Learnt a language, fluent in French, whatever it might be. But the project you need to work on if you're married is your marriage. That by the end of COVID-19, you want to be able to say, our marriage not only survived, but thrived. Was it tough? Absolutely. But by God's grace and a whole bunch of forgiveness and gentleness and patience, we're keeping our vows. For better, for worse. For richer, for poorer. In sickness and in health. As long as we both shall live.